Hello and welcome to Law and Sleep. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, if you're new around here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far this quiet little corner of the internet reaches. Now get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight we travel along the longest and most enduring network of trade routes the ancient and medieval world ever produced. A shifting web of desert tracks, mountain passes and maritime lanes stretching from the eastern coast of China all the way to the Mediterranean shores of Europe, connecting civilizations that, in most cases, never once met each other's rulers or armies, and yet who traded goods, ideas, religions and diseases back and forth across this same vast distance for well over 1,000 years, a network so genuinely vast and so genuinely long-lived that no single empire, however ambitious, ever managed to control the whole of it at once. We are going to the Silk Road, not really a single road at all, but a genuinely enormous, constantly shifting network of caravan tracks and oasis cities, linking Chinese silk workshops to Roman marketplaces, Indian spice merchants to Persian court treasuries, and Buddhist monasteries to Islamic universities across some of the most difficult and most beautiful terrain on the entire planet. This is the story of the merchants, monks, and diplomats who actually made these connections real, one exhausting caravan journey at a time, crossing deserts where a single miscalculated water supply could mean death, and mountain passes where snow could close a route for months at a stretch, carrying goods that could take years to travel from their point of origin to their final destination, changing hands dozens of times along the way, so that the silk finally worn by a wealthy Roman senator had, in all likelihood, passed through the hands of merchants speaking half a dozen different languages before it ever reached him, none of whom ever met one another, and none of whom ever saw both ends of the journey their own single small contribution had helped complete. It is a story about connection across almost unimaginable distance and almost unimaginable cultural difference, achieved not through conquest or empire, though empires certainly rose and fell along its length, but through the simple, patient, repeated human act of trade. It is a story that belongs to the night, the way any long journey does, since caravans crossing the more punishing desert stretches of the route frequently traveled during the cooler hours of darkness, specifically to avoid the killing heat of the daytime desert sun, resting through the worst of the daylight heat in whatever shade a caravanserai or a simple rock outcropping could provide. Meaning that the Silk Road, in its own particular and very literal way, was often a road best travelled beneath the stars. Let it come to you now, slowly. The quiet creak of a loaded camel train moving steadily across a moonlit desert, bells around each animal's neck ringing softly in the cold night air, a sound that has carried across this same stretch of desert for well over 1,000 years now, patient and unhurried and entirely unbothered by whatever century happens to be passing overhead. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet of a desert caravan at rest come to you out of the darkness. A small fire glowing low, camels settled for the night, their long shadows stretching out across the pale sand, and a whole sky of stars stretched out above an ancient trading route that connected half the known world. Quietly, patiently, one careful journey at a time. Let us begin. The vast geographic expanse that the Silk Road would eventually traverse presented some of the most genuinely formidable natural obstacles that any sustained trade network in world history has ever had to overcome, including the Taklamakan Desert in what is now Western China, a genuinely brutal expanse of shifting sand dunes whose very name, according to one commonly repeated, though not entirely certain etymology, may translate roughly as the place you go in but do not come out of. The Gobi Desert stretching across the border regions of modern Mongolia and China, and the towering mountain systems of the Pamirs, sometimes called the Roof of the World, and the Tian Shan, whose high, snow-choked passes connected the desert basins of Central Asia to the fertile river valleys and eventual Mediterranean coastlines lying beyond them. A genuinely daunting combination of extreme heat, extreme cold, and extreme altitude that any successful long-distance trader had to learn to navigate with considerable skill and considerable respect. The earliest organized long-distance trade connections across this challenging landscape considerably predate the more famous, more fully developed network that would eventually earn the name Silk Road, with archaeological evidence including jade objects originating from sources in what is now Xinjiang in western China, recovered from considerably earlier Chinese sites dating back several thousand years before the Common Era, suggesting that at least some form of long-distance overland trade connection across this same general geographic region had already been quietly operating for many centuries before any of the more famous historical figures or historical events this episode's later chapters will examine ever entered the picture. The considerable seasonal and climatic variation across the Silk Road's enormous geographic span meant that successful long-distance travel required genuinely sophisticated practical knowledge of exactly when and exactly which specific route segments were actually passable during any given part of the year, since the high mountain passes of the Pamirs and Tian Shan remained genuinely impassable under heavy snow for large portions of the year, while the desert basins lying between them could become genuinely lethal to cross during the height of summer heat, meaning that experienced caravan leaders needed to plan entire multi-year journeys around this complex, geographically varied seasonal calendar, timing their departure from any given city so as to arrive at the next major mountain crossing during precisely the narrow window when it remained both snow-free and not yet dangerously hot in the desert. Stretches still to come, a logistical planning challenge of genuine sophistication that experienced merchant families passed down across many generations of accumulated practical route knowledge. The Silk Road's own more fully developed and more historically documented emergence as a genuinely continuous, functioning trade network is generally dated by modern historians to the 2nd century before the Common Era, associated substantially with the Chinese Han Dynasty's own deliberate diplomatic and military efforts to establish contact with the various peoples and kingdoms of Central Asia, most significantly through the mission of the Chinese diplomat Zhang Qian, who was dispatched westward by the Han imperial court around 138 before the Common Era, on an original mission to seek military alliance against the nomadic Xiongnu Confederation, then threatening China's own northern frontier. A mission that, though it failed to secure its original intended military alliance, returned to the Han court after many years of travel and, in Zhang Shan's own case, a period of captivity among the Xiongnu, with an entirely unprecedented wealth of geographic and commercial information about the kingdoms, goods, and trade opportunities lying to China's west, information that directly prompted the Han court's subsequent decision to actively establish and protect the trade connections that would eventually mature into the wider network this whole episode examines. Following Zhang Qian's own consequential return and report, the Han dynasty undertook a considerable and sustained program of military and administrative investments specifically intended to secure and protect the newly opened trade connections westward, extending the Great Wall's own defensive fortification system considerably further west than it had previously reached, and establishing a network of garrisoned frontier forts and beacon towers along the route's easternmost stretches, specifically intended to protect merchant caravans from the raiding activity of the same Xiongnu Confederation that Zhang Qian's original mission had originally been intended to counter through diplomatic alliance rather than direct military investment, a genuinely significant and genuinely costly Han imperial commitment to physical trade route security that established an important precedent later Chinese dynasties would continue to draw upon whenever their own resources and their own strategic priorities allowed for comparable investment in frontier trade route protection. The nomadic steppe peoples occupying the vast grassland corridor stretching across the northern reaches of the whole Silk Road region including the Xiongnu already introduced in this chapter, and numerous successor confederations across subsequent centuries, played a genuinely complex and genuinely essential role in the wider trade network's functioning that popular retellings sometimes overlook in favor of the more thoroughly documented sedentary civilizations at either end of the route, since these steppe peoples controlled essential grazing land, essential horse breeding stock, and essential practical knowledge of the harsh steppe environment that settled agricultural and urban civilizations depended upon, meaning that Silk Road trade functioned at every point across its long history through a genuine three-way relationship between the great sedentary civilizations of China, Persia, and the Mediterranean world, the numerous oasis city-states occupying the crucial connective tissue between them, and the mobile steppe peoples whose own military power and own practical expertise neither the sedentary civilizations nor the oasis cities could safely ignore. The Fergana Valley, a fertile basin lying considerably further west of the Taklamakan Desert Basin already discussed in this chapter, watered by the upper reaches of the Sirdarya River, and surrounded on nearly every side by considerable mountain ranges, occupied a genuinely crucial intermediate position along the route's Central Asian stretch, its own famously fertile agricultural land and its own famous horse breeding tradition, already briefly touched upon in this episode's 4th chapter, making it one of the single most consistently prized and consistently contested territories anywhere along the entire length of the route, fought over across many centuries by Chinese, Turkic, Persian, and eventually Mongol and Timurid powers alike, each recognizing the same genuine strategic and economic value in controlling this single, comparatively small but disproportionately significant valley. Zhang Cham's own original mission, already introduced earlier in this chapter, deserves fuller individual attention given just how genuinely difficult and genuinely prolonged an ordeal it actually proved to be, since Zhang Cham was captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately upon departing Han territory and held in captivity for approximately a decade, during which time he apparently married a Xiongnu woman and started a family before eventually escaping and continuing westward to complete at least part of his original diplomatic mission, and upon his eventual return journey he was captured by the Xiongnu a second time for a further period of roughly a year, before finally making his way back to the Han court after an absence of some 13 years total, a genuinely remarkable individual story of sustained personal endurance that underlies the whole subsequent Han imperial decision to invest so heavily in securing the Western trade connections his own difficult journey had first revealed. The Han dynasty's beacon tower system, already briefly introduced earlier in this chapter in connection with frontier security, deserves fuller attention here, since these towers, typically constructed of packed earth and spaced at intervals allowing visual signal contact between neighboring towers, formed a genuinely sophisticated early warning communication network, capable of relaying news of approaching raiders or other emergencies across considerable distances within a matter of hours through a relay of signal fires or smoke columns, a communication technology considerably faster than any messenger could travel on horseback, and surviving archaeological remains of these same beacon towers, still visible today across considerable stretches of the historical route through Western China, provide modern archaeologists with genuinely tangible physical evidence of the extraordinary scale of infrastructure investment that sustained, secure long-distance trade across this difficult terrain actually required. The specific term Silk Road itself, worth clarifying early in this episode given how thoroughly it has entered common modern usage, is not an ancient term at all, but rather a 19th century coinage, first used by the German geographer and explorer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, a considerably later piece of historical naming that this episode's 8th chapter will examine in fuller detail, meaning that the merchants, monks, and diplomats who actually travelled these routes across the many centuries of their active use never once referred to their own journey using this now iconic name, a genuinely useful piece of historical context for understanding that the Silk Road as a single named unified concept is in some real sense a modern historical construction imposed retrospectively onto what its own actual historical participants experienced as a considerably more fragmented, locally organized patchwork of overlapping regional trade relationships rather than any single coherent route with a beginning, an end and a name. The geographic network that would eventually earn this modern name was never, in fact, a single continuous road at all, but rather a genuinely complex and constantly shifting web of alternative routes, branching and rejoining according to local political conditions, seasonal weather, and the specific commercial interests of whichever merchants happened to be making a given journey, with a northern route passing through the oasis cities north of the Taklamakan Desert, a southern route passing along its southern edge, and numerous further branches extending north into the Central Asian steppe, south through mountain passes into India, and eventually west through Persia toward the Mediterranean world, a genuinely intricate network whose full geographic complexity this episode's third chapter will examine, through the specific major cities and oasis settlements that anchored its most significant nodes. Roman geographic knowledge of the distant eastern lands, supplying their own considerable silk imports, remained, throughout most of the empire's history, genuinely vague and genuinely second-hand, with Roman writers generally referring to the distant source of silk simply as the land of the Ceres, the Silk People, possessing only the most fragmentary and often considerably inaccurate understanding of Chinese geography, Chinese political organization, or the actual physical distance separating Rome from China, a genuine asymmetry of geographic knowledge between the trade network's two most economically significant endpoints that reflects just how thoroughly intermediary merchants and intermediary political powers, including the Parthians this episode's sixth chapter will examine in fuller detail, controlled and limited direct contact between the route's most distant participants. The Silk Road functioned not merely as a conduit for material goods, but as one of the single most significant channels of religious and philosophical exchange in the whole of pre-modern world history, since the same merchant caravans, oasis cities and mountain passes that carried silk, spices, and precious metals also carried missionaries, pilgrims, and religious texts across the very same enormous distances, meaning that the spread of several of the world's major religious traditions beyond their original points of origin owes a very direct and very considerable debt to the physical infrastructure and physical safety that organized Silk Road trade routes and their associated way stations provided. The distinctive Gandharan artistic style that developed in the border region between modern Pakistan and Afghanistan during the early centuries of the Common Era, blending Buddhist religious subject matter with artistic techniques and stylistic conventions directly derived from the Hellenistic Greek artistic tradition that Alexander the Great's own earlier conquests had introduced to the region centuries before, represents a further genuinely striking example of the kind of cultural synthesis that Silk Road religious and artistic exchange regularly produced, since Gandharan sculptors developed the earliest known anthropomorphic depictions of the Buddha in human form, an artistic innovation that would go on to shape Buddhist artistic representation across the whole of Central Asia, China, and eventually the wider Buddhist world. A direct visible legacy of Greek artistic influence traveling eastward along trade routes that would eventually carry it, transformed through this cultural encounter, considerably further east still. Buddhism's own spread from its original homeland in northern India into Central Asia, and from there into China, Korea, and eventually Japan, represents perhaps the single most historically significant example of Silk Road religious transmission, with Buddhist monks and pilgrims traveling the same trade routes as merchants, often under the same practical protection that organized caravan travel provided against the considerable dangers of banditry and difficult terrain, carrying sacred texts, religious relics, and Buddhist artistic and architectural traditions that took root and flourished in oasis cities across Central Asia, before continuing their journey into China itself, where Buddhism would eventually become one of the most historically significant and most enduringly influential religious traditions in all of subsequent Chinese history. Jewish merchant communities, most notably a network of traders modern historians call the Radhanites, active particularly during the early medieval period, between roughly the 8th and 10th centuries, established their own considerable long-distance trading connections, spanning from Western Europe through the Mediterranean and Middle East to India and China, operating across the religious and political boundaries separating the Christian, Islamic, and various Asian worlds with a genuine practical flexibility that their own distinct religious and communal identity and their own considerable multilingual capability apparently made possible in ways that merchants more closely tied to any single one of the region's major political or religious authorities sometimes found more difficult to replicate, a further genuinely significant thread within the wider tapestry of religiously and ethnically diverse Silk Road commercial activity this whole chapter has examined. Manichaeism, a now largely vanished but once genuinely significant religious tradition founded by the 3rd century Persian prophet Mani, blending elements of Zoroastrian, Christian, and Buddhist theology into its own distinctive dualistic religious framework, emphasizing an ongoing cosmic struggle between forces of light and forces of darkness, spread with particular success along the Silk Road's Central Asian stretches, eventually becoming for a period the officially adopted state religion of the Uyghur Khaganate, a Central Asian steppe empire that controlled significant stretches of the trade route during the 8th and 9th centuries, a genuinely striking example of a religious tradition that, though it did not ultimately survive into the modern era in the way that Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam all did, nonetheless achieved genuine and significant political as well as religious influence precisely because of the same trade route infrastructure and trade route cultural exchange that this chapter's other examples have already illustrated. The Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang, whose own remarkable 7th century pilgrimage westward along the Silk Road to India in search of authentic Buddhist scriptures and teachings, would eventually inspire the classic later Chinese novel Journey to the West, undertook a journey of genuinely extraordinary scope and genuinely extraordinary personal hardship, traveling for some 17 years across Central Asia and India, visiting numerous Buddhist monasteries and holy sites, studying under leading Buddhist teachers, and eventually returning to China with a substantial collection of Buddhist texts that he spent much of the remainder of his life translating, a single individual pilgrim's journey whose surviving detailed travel account provides modern historians with one of the single most valuable first-hand descriptions available of the actual physical and cultural landscape of the Silk Road during this particular period of its long history. Nestorian Christianity, a specific branch of Eastern Christian theology that had been formally declared heretical by the wider mainstream Christian Church following the 5th century Council of Ephesus, found genuine and lasting refuge and continued growth precisely along these same Silk Road trade routes, since Nestorian Christian communities, expelled from the doctrinal mainstream of the Roman and Byzantine Christian world, already discussed in this channel's own earlier coverage of Byzantium, established churches and monasteries across Persia and Central Asia, and eventually reached China itself, where a still surviving 8th century stone monument, known as the Nestorian Stele, discovered near the ancient Chinese capital of Chang'an in the 17th century, documents the presence of an established and apparently thriving Christian community operating within the Tang dynasty imperial capital, a genuinely striking piece of physical evidence for just how far this particular branch of Christianity had travelled along the trade routes this episode examines. Islam's own considerable spread eastward along the Silk Road following the religion's 7th century founding and rapid subsequent expansion represents a further genuinely significant chapter within this wider pattern of religious transmission, with Muslim merchants, scholars, and eventually entire Muslim political dynasties establishing themselves across increasingly large portions of Central Asia over the following centuries, transforming the religious and cultural character of numerous major Silk Road cities and eventually establishing Islam as the dominant religious tradition across large stretches of the route's Central Asian midsection. A transformation that this episode's later chapters, particularly its consideration of the route's medieval political history, will examine in further contextual detail. Jewish merchant communities, most notably a network of traders modern historians call the Radhanites, active particularly during the early medieval period between roughly the 8th and 10th centuries, established their own considerable long-distance trading connections spanning from Western Europe through the Mediterranean and Middle East to India and China, operating across the religious and political boundaries separating the Christian, Islamic, and various Asian worlds with a genuine practical flexibility that their own distinct religious and communal identity and their own considerable multilingual capability apparently made possible in ways that merchants more closely tied to any single one of the region's major political or religious authorities sometimes found more difficult to replicate, a further genuinely significant thread within the wider tapestry of religiously and ethnically diverse Silk Road commercial activity this whole chapter is examined. Tibetan Buddhism's own distinctive later development, drawing substantially on Indian Buddhist tantric traditions transmitted northward across Himalayan trade and pilgrimage routes, closely connected to the wider Silk Road network. This episode primarily examines produced a genuinely significant regional variant of the wider Buddhist tradition already discussed in this chapter, and Tibet's own considerable geographic position, controlling several important mountain passes connecting the Silk Road's Central Asian routes to the separate but related trading networks of South Asia, meant that Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and Tibetan Buddhist trade connections became genuinely significant nodes within the wider religious and commercial network this whole episode traces, particularly during the later medieval period, when Tibetan Buddhist religious authority extended its own considerable influence into Mongol court religious life, following the Mongol Empire's own conversion to Tibetan Buddhism under several of its later Khans. Sufi mysticism, the considerably more contemplative and considerably more experientially oriented strand of Islamic spiritual practice that developed and flourished particularly across the medieval Central Asian and Persian portions of the Islamic world, found in the Silk Road's own network of trading cities and traveling merchant communities, a particularly receptive and particularly well-suited environment for its own further spread, since wandering Sufi teachers and Sufi religious orders, organized into structured brotherhoods called tariqas, frequently traveled the same trade routes as merchants, establishing lodges and gathering communities of devoted followers in city after city along the route, and Sufi poetry and Sufi religious thought, including the enormously influential later work of the Persian poet Rumi, whose own family itself migrated westward along Silk Road routes fleeing the advancing Mongol conquests. This episode's 6th chapter will examine in fuller detail, came to exercise a genuinely profound and genuinely lasting influence on the wider religious and literary culture of the entire Central Asian and Persian-speaking world. Chinese Confucian scholar officials, though considerably less associated in popular modern imagination with long-distance Silk Road travel than the Buddhist pilgrims already discussed in this chapter, occasionally undertook their own significant journeys westward along the route in an official diplomatic or administrative capacity, and the considerable body of surviving Chinese official travel writing and official geographic reporting that resulted from these journeys, including detailed accounts of the customs, products, and political circumstances of the various kingdoms and cities these officials visited, provided the wider Chinese imperial government with genuinely valuable practical intelligence informing its own ongoing diplomatic and commercial policy toward the Central Asian world. A further significant category of surviving Silk Road travel literature, standing alongside the more famous religious pilgrimage accounts this chapter has already examined in connection with figures including Xuanzang. The considerable spread of Buddhist textual culture along the Silk Road already discussed in this chapter primarily in terms of religious content, also carried significant practical technological consequence, since the Buddhist tradition's own considerable emphasis on the careful reproduction and wide distribution of sacred texts as a genuine form of religious merit-making directly encouraged the early adoption and early refinement of woodblock printing technology across Buddhist communities in China and Central Asia with the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text recovered from the same Dunhuang manuscript cave already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter and dated to the year 868, representing the oldest surviving complete printed book bearing an actual reliable date anywhere in the world, a genuinely significant piece of religious and technological history that illustrates just how closely intertwined religious motivation and technological innovation frequently became along the trade routes this episode examines. Zoroastrianism, the considerably older Persian religious tradition already established across much of the Iranian plateau and wider Persian cultural sphere well before the rise of any of the other traditions already discussed in this chapter, maintained a genuinely significant presence along the western portions of the Silk Road throughout much of its ancient and early medieval history, with Zoroastrian merchants and communities, including the historically significant Sogdian merchant network this episode's 4th chapter will examine in considerably fuller detail, carrying their own distinctive religious practices and religious institutions eastward alongside their commercial activities, a further thread in the genuinely rich and genuinely diverse religious tapestry that made the Silk Road, considered as a whole across its full length and its full history, one of the most religiously plural and religiously interconnected regions anywhere in the pre-modern world. Chang'an, serving as the imperial capital of both the Han and, later, the Tang dynasties at different points across Chinese history, functioned as the eastern anchor point of the entire wider Silk Road network, a genuinely enormous cosmopolitan city that, at the height of Tang dynasty rule in the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, is estimated by modern historians to have housed close to 1 million residents, making it very plausibly the single largest city anywhere in the world during this particular period, its population including substantial resident communities of foreign merchants, diplomats and religious figures from across the whole of Central Asia and beyond. A genuine cosmopolitan diversity reflected in the city's own considerable variety of foreign markets, foreign religious institutions including the Nestorian Christian community already discussed in this episode's 2nd chapter, and foreign cultural influence visible across Tang dynasty art, music and fashion. Turfan, an oasis settlement positioned in a genuinely remarkable geographic depression, lying below sea level and consequently experiencing summer temperatures among the highest recorded anywhere in Central Asia, developed its own considerable ingenious system of underground irrigation channels called karez, drawing meltwater from distant mountains through tunnels specifically engineered to minimize evaporation loss across the intervening desert distance, an impressive feat of ancient hydraulic engineering that allowed the settlement to sustain productive agriculture, including its own historically significant grape and raisin production, despite its genuinely extreme surrounding desert climate, and Turfan's own surviving Buddhist cave temple complexes, somewhat less extensively studied than the comparable Dunhuang complex already discussed in this chapter, but similarly rich in surviving mural art, provide further valuable evidence of the same wider pattern of Silk Road Buddhist religious and artistic flourishing this episode's 2nd chapter has already examined. Turfan, an oasis settlement positioned in a genuinely remarkable geographic depression lying below sea level and consequently experiencing summer temperatures among the highest recorded anywhere in Central Asia, developed its own considerable ingenious system of underground irrigation channels called karez, drawing meltwater from distant mountains through tunnels specifically engineered to minimize evaporation loss across the intervening desert distance, an impressive feat of ancient hydraulic engineering that allowed the settlement to sustain productive agriculture, including its own historically significant grape and raisin production, despite its genuinely extreme surrounding desert climate, and Turfan's own surviving Buddhist cave temple complexes, somewhat less extensively studied than the comparable Dunhuang complex already discussed in this chapter, but similarly rich in surviving mural art, provide further valuable evidence of the same wider pattern of Silk Road Buddhist religious and artistic flourishing this episode's second chapter has already examined. Khotan, positioned along the southern branch of the route skirting the Taklamakan Desert's southern edge, built its own considerable historical prosperity substantially on the jade trade already briefly mentioned in this episode's fourth chapter. Since the riverbed surrounding Khotan yielded high-quality jade that Chinese buyers, for whom jade carried genuinely profound cultural and symbolic significance, extending back many centuries before the Silk Road's own more formal development, prized above jade sourced from virtually any other known location, making Khotan's own jade trade one of the single oldest continuously operating specific commodity trades anywhere along the entire route, predating, as this episode's first chapter has already noted, even the 2nd century formal establishment of the wider trade network this whole episode primarily examines, and Khotan's own considerable Buddhist heritage, reflected in its own substantial surviving body of Buddhist manuscripts and Buddhist artistic remains, further connects the city to the wider pattern of Silk Road religious flourishing this episode's second chapter has examined at length. Kashgar, positioned at the far western edge of the Taklamakan Desert Basin where the northern and southern route branches finally reconverged, before continuing on toward the formidable mountain crossings of the Pamirs, functioned as a genuinely crucial final staging point for merchants preparing to undertake the considerable additional hardship of crossing into the Central Asian territories beyond. Its own bustling markets, historically renowned for bringing together an extraordinary wide range of goods, languages, and peoples from every direction the wider trade network extended. A genuine crossroads city whose considerable strategic importance meant it changed political hands repeatedly across the centuries as various Chinese, Central Asian, and eventually Mongol and Timurid political authorities each recognized the same essential commercial value in controlling this particular geographic choke point. Chang'an's own carefully planned urban layout, organized according to a precise rectangular grid divided into numerous individually walled residential wards, included specifically designated quarters where the city's considerable foreign merchant population, including Sogdian, Persian, and Central Asian traders already discussed earlier in this chapter, maintained their own residences, warehouses, and places of worship, a degree of deliberate urban planning accommodation for foreign commercial and religious communities that reflects just how thoroughly the Tang dynasty imperial government understood sustained foreign trade as a genuine and valuable ongoing feature of the capital's own economic and cultural life, rather than as any kind of temporary or marginal activity to be merely tolerated at the city's edges. Dunhuang, a considerably smaller but historically and archaeologically enormously significant oasis city, positioned at a genuinely crucial junction point where the routes around the northern and southern edges of the Taklamakan Desert converged before continuing westward, developed into one of the single most important Buddhist religious and artistic centers anywhere along the entire Silk Road, home to the remarkable Mulgao Caves, a complex of nearly 500 individual cave temples carved into a cliff face over the course of many centuries, decorated with an extraordinary wealth of Buddhist mural paintings and sculptures that survive today as one of the single richest surviving collections of pre-modern Buddhist art anywhere in the world, and famous also for the accidental modern discovery, in the early 20th century, of a sealed library cave containing tens of thousands of manuscripts and documents in numerous different languages, providing modern scholars with an extraordinary rich body of primary source material documenting the actual, lived religious, commercial, and daily life of this single Silk Road oasis city across many centuries. The circumstances surrounding the modern discovery of Dunhuang's sealed manuscript library deserve fuller attention here, since the cave itself was first opened in 1900 by a local Taoist monk named Wang Yunlu, who had taken on informal responsibility for the site's upkeep and whose accidental discovery of the sealed chamber containing tens of thousands of manuscripts that had apparently been deliberately walled up and hidden sometime around the 11th century, for reasons modern scholars still debate, eventually attracted the attention of the Hungarian-British archaeologist Aurel Stein, who arrived in 1907 and negotiated the acquisition of a substantial portion of the manuscript collection for British institutions, an acquisition that, while providing considerable scholarly benefit through subsequent careful study and preservation, has also become, as this episode's 8th chapter will discuss further, a genuine and still contested example of the wider pattern of early 20th century archaeological removal of significant historical material from its original site of discovery. Samarkand, positioned considerably further west in what is now Uzbekistan, developed into one of the single most important and most consistently prosperous cities anywhere along the Silk Road's Central Asian midsection, serving as a major crossroads connecting routes heading toward Persia, India, and the Central Asian steppe, and reaching a particular height of architectural and cultural splendor during the later medieval period under the rule of the conqueror Timur, known in the Western world as Tamerlane, who made Samarkand his own imperial capital in the late 14th century and commissioned an extraordinary program of monumental architectural construction, including elaborately tiled mosques and mausoleums whose distinctive blue and turquoise decorative ceramics remain, to this day, among the single most visually striking and most immediately recognizable examples of Central Asian Islamic architecture anywhere in the world. Bukhara, another major Central Asian oasis city positioned not far from Samarkand, developed its own considerable reputation as a major center of Islamic scholarship and learning during the medieval period, home to numerous significant madrasas, institutions of higher Islamic religious and legal education, and serving as the birthplace or adopted home of numerous historically significant medieval Islamic scholars, including the philosopher and physician Avicenna, whose own medical writings would go on to exercise considerable influence across both the medieval Islamic and, through subsequent translation, the medieval European scholarly and medical world alike. Bukhara, another major Central Asian oasis city positioned not far from Samarkand, developed its own considerable reputation as a major center of Islamic scholarship and learning during the medieval period, home to numerous significant madrasas, institutions of higher Islamic religious and legal education, and serving as the birthplace or adopted home of numerous historically significant medieval Islamic scholars, including the philosopher and physician Avicenna, whose own medical writings would go on to exercise considerable influence across both the medieval Islamic and, through subsequent translation, the medieval European scholarly and medical world alike. Balkh, an ancient city in what is now northern Afghanistan, sometimes called the Mother of Cities, in recognition of its own considerable antiquity and considerable historical significance, served across many centuries as a major regional center connecting the Silk Road's Central Asian routes to trade and pilgrimage routes heading south into India, and Balkh's own considerable Buddhist heritage, predating the region's later Islamic conversion, made it, alongside Bamiyan a short distance away with its own famous monumental Buddha statues carved directly into a cliff face, one of the single most historically significant centers of Buddhist religious and artistic life anywhere along the Silk Road's southern branches, and Balkh holds the further distinction of being the birthplace of the poet Rumi, already discussed in this episode's 2nd chapter, whose own family's westward flight from the city ahead of the advancing Mongol armies eventually carried them to Anatolia, where Rumi would go on to compose the considerable body of Persian mystical poetry, for which he remains celebrated across the wider world today. Herat, positioned in what is now western Afghanistan, developed into a further genuinely significant regional center of trade, scholarship, and artistic production, reaching a particular height of cultural flourishing during the 15th century under Timurid rule, when Herat's own royal workshops produced some of the single finest surviving examples of medieval Persian miniature painting and manuscript illumination, a genuine artistic golden age that reflected the same pattern of concentrated wealth and concentrated cultural patronage this episode has already examined in connection with Timur's own architectural investment in Samarkand, illustrating how the considerable commercial wealth that successful Silk Road trade generated repeatedly translated across numerous different cities and numerous different historical periods into genuinely significant investment in art, architecture, and scholarship that considerably outlasted the specific commercial conditions that had originally generated the wealth funding it. Merv, positioned in what is now Turkmenistan along one of the Silk Road's central routes, reached its own particular height of prosperity and scale during the medieval Islamic period, with some medieval sources describing it, at its height in the 12th century, as among the largest cities anywhere in the world, before suffering a genuinely catastrophic destruction at the hands of the invading Mongol army in 1221, this episode's later chapters will examine in connection with the wider Mongol conquest's complex and, in certain specific respects, genuinely paradoxical impact on the wider Silk Road trade network, since the same Mongol conquests that inflicted such catastrophic destruction on individual cities like Merv would, once the initial conquest period had passed, eventually usher in a period of unprecedented transcontinental trade security and trade volume that this episode's 6th chapter will examine in considerably fuller detail. Baghdad, founded in the late 8th century as the new imperial capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, developed with remarkable speed into one of the single largest and single most intellectually significant cities anywhere in the medieval world. Its own House of Wisdom, already discussed in this channel's earlier coverage of both ancient astronomy and the Library of Alexandria, in connection with its central role in translating and preserving Greek scientific and philosophical texts, functioning as a genuine Western intellectual terminus for knowledge and manuscripts arriving via Silk Road trade connections from India, Persia, and Central Asia alike, making Baghdad not merely a commercial hub, but one of the single most significant clearinghouses of scientific and philosophical knowledge anywhere along the entire length of the wider trade network. Palmyra, an ancient oasis city in the Syrian desert that had already flourished as a significant caravan trading center during the earlier Roman imperial period, occupied a genuinely crucial position linking Mediterranean Roman markets to Mesopotamian and, beyond that, Persian and Central Asian trade routes, reaching a particular height of wealth and political independence during the 3rd century of the Common Era under its own remarkable ruler, Queen Zenobia, who briefly carved out an independent Palmyrene empire stretching across considerable portions of the Roman Near East before Roman forces eventually reconquered the city, and Palmyra's own extraordinarily well-preserved classical ruins, including monumental colonnaded streets and elaborate funerary monuments, stand today as physical testimony to just how genuinely wealthy and genuinely cosmopolitan this particular western terminus of the wider Silk Road trading system actually became during its own particular centuries of greatest prosperity. Antioch, another major Roman-era city positioned along the eastern Mediterranean coast, served as a further crucial western commercial terminus where goods arriving via the overland Silk Road routes through Palmyra and the wider Syrian desert met Mediterranean maritime shipping routes, making Antioch, alongside Alexandria already discussed in this channel's own earlier coverage, one of the handful of truly cosmopolitan supercities of the ancient Mediterranean world, whose own considerable wealth and considerable cultural sophistication depended directly on functioning as a genuine meeting point between the overland Asian trade routes this whole episode examines and the equally significant maritime trading networks that connected the Mediterranean world to Egypt, North Africa, and the wider Atlantic-facing regions of Roman and later Byzantine control. Silk itself, the luxury textile that gave the entire trade network its modern name, represented, for the overwhelming majority of the route's active history, an exclusively Chinese manufacturing secret produced through the labor-intensive cultivation of silkworms feeding on mulberry leaves and the subsequent careful unwinding and weaving of the fine silk thread the worm's own cocoons produced, a manufacturing process that Chinese authorities guarded with considerable and, for many centuries, largely successful secrecy, making finished Chinese silk one of the single most valuable and most consistently demanded luxury goods traded across the entire length of the Silk Road, prized across Persia, India, and eventually the Roman Mediterranean world for a combination of its genuine physical luxury and its function as an unmistakable visible marker of considerable wealth and considerable social status for whoever wore it. The Roman world's own considerable appetite for imported Chinese silk, reaching the Mediterranean only after passing through numerous intermediary hands and numerous intermediary markups across its long overland journey, became sufficiently well established by the early centuries of the Common Era that several Roman writers, including the philosopher Seneca, expressed genuine moral disapproval of what they considered the excessive expense and excessive moral frivolity of Roman elite silk consumption, a considerable Roman demand that, according to some ancient sources, contributed to a genuinely significant ongoing drain of Roman gold and silver eastward along the trade routes in payment for silk and other Eastern luxury goods, an economic dynamic that several ancient Roman commentators specifically worried represented a genuine long-term drain on Roman imperial finances. China's own silk manufacturing secret was eventually broken, according to a story preserved by several ancient and medieval sources, though with some variation in the specific details different versions provide. When silkworm eggs were smuggled westward, in one frequently repeated version of the story concealed within a hollow bamboo walking staff, carried by Christian monks traveling to the Byzantine imperial court, during the reign of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century of the Common Era, already discussed in this channel's own earlier coverage of Byzantium, an act of industrial espionage that eventually allowed the Byzantine Empire, and from there the wider Mediterranean and European world, to establish their own independent silk production industries, gradually reducing, though never entirely eliminating, the Mediterranean world's dependence on imported Chinese silk across the following centuries. Tea, though more closely associated in popular modern memory with the considerably later maritime trade routes that would eventually connect China to Europe by sea, also travelled overland along Silk Road and related Central Asian trade routes from a relatively early period, with a specific network of trade routes connecting Chinese tea-producing regions to Tibet and the wider Central Asian steppe, sometimes called the Tea Horse Road, developing as a genuinely significant specialized branch of the wider transcontinental trade network, in which Chinese tea was exchanged specifically for the prized Central Asian and Tibetan horses that Chinese military forces required in considerable numbers, a specialized commodity-for-commodity exchange network that operated according to its own particular logistical and commercial logic, somewhat distinct from, though genuinely connected to, the wider silk and spice trade that this chapter's other sections have already examined. The specific weaving techniques that Chinese silk producers developed and, for many centuries, successfully kept secret from foreign competitors, extended well beyond the basic silkworm cultivation process already discussed earlier in this chapter, encompassing genuinely sophisticated loom technology and genuinely sophisticated pattern weaving techniques capable of producing the elaborate figured silk designs that made finished Chinese silk textiles so consistently prized above the comparatively simpler, plain weave silk that other producing regions, even after acquiring silkworm cultivation technology itself, following the 6th century smuggling episode already discussed in this chapter, often continued to find difficult to fully replicate, meaning that finished Chinese silk textiles retained a genuine premium market value, even in later centuries when raw silk production itself had spread considerably more widely across the Eurasian world. Paper money, a further genuinely significant Chinese financial and technological innovation building directly on the earlier papermaking technology already discussed in this chapter, developed first within China itself during the Tang and Song dynasties as a genuinely practical solution to the considerable physical inconvenience of transporting large quantities of heavy metal coinage across long trading distances. And while paper currency itself never achieved comparably widespread adoption outside China during the medieval Silk Road period, Marco Polo's own travel account, already discussed extensively throughout this episode, includes a detailed and evidently genuinely astonished description of the Mongol imperial government's own use of paper currency, a financial innovation so unfamiliar to Polo's own medieval European readers that his account of it was, according to some later commentators, initially received with a degree of genuine skepticism among readers who found the very concept of valuable paper currency, backed by nothing more than governmental authority rather than the metal content, difficult to credit. Precious stones beyond the lapis lazuli already discussed in this chapter also travelled along Silk Road routes in considerable quantity, including rubies and other gemstones sourced from mines in Afghanistan and Burma. Coral traded from Mediterranean sources eastward towards Central Asian and Chinese markets, where it held particular decorative and, in several documented cases, medicinal cultural significance. And amber, travelling along a further specific trade route sometimes called the Amber Road, connecting Baltic Sea sources to Mediterranean and eventually broader Eurasian markets, a further genuinely significant category of Silk Road luxury commerce that, like the lapis lazuli already discussed, considerably predates the more formally organized 2nd century network this episode has primarily examined throughout its preceding chapters. Beyond silk itself, the Silk Road carried a genuinely enormous variety of additional traded goods across its long history, including spices, particularly valuable varieties originating from India and Southeast Asia, including pepper, cinnamon and cloves, that commanded genuinely enormous markups by the time they reached distant Mediterranean or European markets. Precious stones and metals, including jade, considered particularly precious within Chinese culture, and traded westward from Central Asian sources, and gold and silver moving in various directions depending on the specific commercial and monetary conditions prevailing at any given time. Glass and glassware, particularly fine Roman and later Islamic glass, traded eastward into China and Central Asia, where it was considered a genuinely exotic and highly prized luxury good. And paper, one of ancient China's most significant technological innovations, whose own gradual westward transmission along the Silk Road, reaching the Islamic world by the 8th century and eventually medieval Europe by the 12th, represents one of the single most historically consequential examples of technological transmission that this entire trade network ever produced. The considerable price markup that Chinese silk accumulated by the time it finally reached its most distant Mediterranean markets reflected not merely simple profit-seeking at each stage of its long relay journey, already discussed in this episode's 5th chapter, but also the genuine accumulated cost of the taxes, tolls and security expenses that each successive merchant and each successive political jurisdiction along the route legitimately added to the goods passing through their own particular territory, meaning that a bolt of silk sold in Rome might, by some ancient estimates, command a price many times higher than its original Chinese production cost, a considerable markup that nonetheless remained genuinely worthwhile for the merchants involved at every stage of the journey, precisely because silk's exceptional value density, enormous worth relative to its modest weight and modest bulk, made it one of the very few goods genuinely capable of absorbing this much accumulated transport cost, while still remaining profitably saleable at its final destination. Chinese porcelain, though considerably more associated in popular modern memory with the later maritime trade routes that would eventually carry enormous quantities of finished ceramic ware directly to European markets, also travelled westward along overland Silk Road routes from a relatively early period, with fragments of Chinese ceramic ware recovered by modern archaeologists at sites across Central Asia, Persia and the wider Islamic world, providing physical evidence of this overland ceramic trade, and Chinese porcelain production techniques themselves, along with Chinese decorative motifs, exercised considerable influence on the development of Persian and later Ottoman ceramic traditions, a further example of the same pattern of technological and artistic cross-pollination that this whole chapter has traced across numerous different specific traded commodities. Gunpowder, another genuinely consequential Chinese technological innovation originally developed for uses including fireworks and, relatively quickly thereafter, military applications, followed a broadly comparable pattern of gradual westward transmission along Silk Road and related trade and military contact routes, reaching the Islamic world by the 13th century and medieval Europe not long afterward, a transmission whose exact specific pathway and exact specific timing modern historians continue to research and debate, but whose eventual consequences for the whole subsequent history of warfare and, in time, for the broader global balance of military and political power between different world regions, proved genuinely difficult to overstate. Horses represented a further genuinely significant category of Silk Road trade, particularly the prized breeds of Central Asian horses, including the so-called heavenly horses of Fergana, that Chinese sources describe with considerable admiration, whose superior size and speed relative to native Chinese horse breeds made them genuinely valuable military and diplomatic commodities that Chinese dynasties across many centuries actively sought to acquire through trade, tribute, and on several notable occasions, including a dedicated Han Dynasty military campaign specifically launched to secure access to Fergana's horse breeding stock. Outright military conquest, a trade in living animals that required its own specialized logistics and specialized caravan expertise, quite distinct from the transport of the various inanimate luxury goods already discussed elsewhere in this chapter. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue semi-precious stone whose only significant ancient source lay in the remote mountains of what is now northeastern Afghanistan, represents one of the single longest traveling and single most historically significant luxury goods to move along the trade routes this whole episode examines, since lapis lazuli mined in this single remote Afghan source region has been recovered by modern archaeologists at sites as distant as ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia, already discussed in this channel's own earlier coverage of both civilizations, dating back many centuries before the more formally organized Silk Road network this episode primarily examines had even developed, meaning that some form of long-distance trade connection carrying this single distinctive stone had already been operating across a genuinely enormous stretch of Eurasian territory for well over 3,000 years before Zhang Qian's own more famous 2nd century mission, a striking reminder that the underlying human impulse toward long-distance luxury trade considerably predates any of the more formally organized and more thoroughly documented trade networks this episode has primarily focused upon. Glass and glassware, already briefly mentioned earlier in this chapter, deserves fuller individual attention given the genuinely remarkable direction of its own trade flow, since fine Roman and later Islamic glass, produced using techniques including glass blowing that had reached a considerable level of technical sophistication in the Roman Mediterranean world, traveled eastward into China and Central Asia, where local glass-making technology remained considerably less developed, making finished Western glassware a genuinely prized and genuinely exotic luxury good among wealthy Chinese consumers, a reversal of the more familiar eastward flow of Chinese silk that illustrates just how thoroughly the Silk Road functioned as a genuinely two-directional exchange of specialized, regional manufacturing expertise rather than any simple one-way transfer of goods from a single dominant producing civilization to a single passive consuming one. Indigo and other natural dyes, including the specifically prized deep red dye extracted from a particular scale insect native to Central Asia and traded under various regional names, represented a further significant category of Silk Road commercial exchange, since the specific dyeing techniques and specific dye sources available in any given region, considerably shaped the distinctive color palette that region's own textile production became known for, and the trade in both raw dye materials and finished dyed textiles allowed wealthy consumers across an enormous geographic range to access colors and color combinations that would otherwise have been entirely unavailable using only their own region's local dye sources. A further genuinely significant, if less immediately dramatic category of Silk Road luxury trade, standing alongside the silk, spices and precious stones this chapter has already examined in fuller detail. Medicinal substances and pharmaceutical ingredients represented a further genuinely significant, if considerably less visually dramatic, category of Silk Road trade, with specific medicinal plants, minerals, and animal products traveling in both directions along the route as physicians and pharmacists across the whole Eurasian medical world sought out ingredients unavailable within their own immediate region, and the considerable medieval Islamic medical tradition already touched upon in this episode's third chapter in connection with Avicenna developed genuinely sophisticated pharmaceutical compendiums cataloguing the specific properties and specific geographic sources of many hundreds of individual medicinal substances, a body of accumulated practical pharmaceutical knowledge that depended directly on the same sustained trade connections this whole episode examines to actually obtain the physical ingredients its own theoretical medical knowledge required. The specific weaving techniques that Chinese silk producers developed and, for many centuries, successfully kept secret from foreign competitors, extended well beyond the basic silkworm cultivation process already discussed earlier in this chapter, encompassing genuinely sophisticated loom technology and genuinely sophisticated pattern weaving techniques capable of producing the elaborate figured silk designs that made finished Chinese silk textiles so consistently prized above the comparatively simpler plain weave silk that other producing regions, even after acquiring silkworm cultivation technology itself, following the 6th century smuggling episode already discussed in this chapter, often continued to find difficult to fully replicate, meaning that finished Chinese silk textiles retained a genuine premium market value even in later centuries when raw silk production itself had spread considerably more widely across the Eurasian world. The Bactrian camel, a genuinely remarkable pack animal distinguished by its 2 humps and its exceptional tolerance for both extreme desert heat and extreme mountain cold, served as the essential logistical backbone of overland Silk Road trade across the great majority of its long history, capable of carrying substantial loads across genuinely punishing terrain for extended periods with minimal water, a combination of practical qualities that made the Bactrian camel, rather than horses, donkeys, or any other available pack animal, the specific animal of choice for the long desert and mountain crossings that characterized the Silk Road's most physically demanding stretches, and the specialized knowledge required to successfully manage and navigate with camel caravans across these difficult environments represented a genuinely valuable and genuinely specialized professional skill passed down through generations of experienced caravan leaders and caravan guides. A typical major Silk Road caravan, particularly on the more dangerous and more remote stretches of the route, might comprise anywhere from several dozen to, in the case of the largest and most well-organized expeditions, several hundred camels traveling together under the coordinated leadership of an experienced caravan master, since traveling in such organized groups offered essential collective protection against banditry and essential collective support in the event of illness, injury, or equipment failure along the way, a genuinely necessary form of practical cooperation that meant individual merchants, however fierce their commercial rivalry once goods actually reached market, typically had every practical incentive to travel together in large, mutually protective groups for the genuinely dangerous journey itself. Beyond the merchants and caravan leaders already discussed throughout this chapter, A successful major caravan expedition required the coordinated labor of numerous additional specialized roles, including experienced animal handlers with genuine practical veterinary knowledge of camel health and camel care, since a sick or injured camel losing its ability to continue the journey could genuinely endanger the entire expedition's cargo and, in the most severe circumstances, its members' own survival, and specialized local guides, frequently recruited from communities with generations of accumulated practical knowledge of a particular difficult stretch of terrain, whose specific knowledge of reliable water sources, safe mountain passes, and areas of particular banditry risk represented a genuinely essential and genuinely well-compensated form of practical expertise that outside merchants, however experienced in the wider business of long-distance trade, typically could not safely replicate on their own without this kind of specific, hard-won local knowledge. The specific architectural design of a well-built caravanserai reflected genuine accumulated practical experience regarding exactly what a tired, dusty caravan actually required after a long day's difficult travel, with a large central courtyard typically featuring a water source, whether a well, a cistern, or, in more fortunate locations, a natural spring, positioned centrally enough that every arriving animal could be watered without excessive additional movement, and the surrounding structure typically rising 2 stories in the more substantial examples, with ground floor spaces used for storing goods and stabling animals, and upper floor rooms providing the merchants themselves with lodging, offering at least some modest separation from the considerable noise and considerable smell of the animals below. A practical architectural logic, refined and repeated across many centuries and many thousands of individual caravanserai constructed across the entire length of the route. Merchant guilds and merchant associations, organized along lines of shared regional origin, shared religious affiliation, or shared specific commodity specialization, developed across numerous major Silk Road trading cities to provide their own members with mutual practical support, shared warehouse and lodging facilities, and a collective institutional voice in negotiating with local rulers and local tax authorities, a pattern of merchant self-organization that, while taking somewhat different specific institutional forms in different regions and different religious communities along the route, served broadly comparable practical functions to the merchant guilds that were simultaneously developing within medieval European trading cities. A further genuinely interesting example of similarly motivated commercial institutions developing independently in geographically distant but functionally comparable trading contexts. The Sogdians, a Central Asian Iranian-speaking people whose homeland lay in the region around Samarkand and Bukhara, already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter, developed across many centuries into the single most historically significant and most widely dispersed merchant network operating along the Silk Road's central and eastern stretches, with Sogdian merchant communities establishing permanent trading colonies in cities across Central Asia and China alike, and the Sogdian language itself functioning for several centuries as a genuine lingua franca of Silk Road commerce, understood and used by merchants of many different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, conducting business across the network's Central Asian core, a level of specialized commercial expertise and specialized linguistic reach that made the Sogdians, though never possessing anything resembling their own unified political empire, one of the single most historically consequential peoples in the entire history of the Silk Road trade network. Silk Road merchant enterprises frequently operated as genuine multi-generational family businesses, with sons trained from a young age in the practical commercial, linguistic and geographic knowledge their fathers had themselves accumulated across their own careers, and surviving Sogdian commercial correspondence recovered by modern archaeologists, including a remarkable collection of ancient letters discovered along the route and now generally known as the Sogdian Ancient Letters, reveals genuinely detailed practical business correspondence discussing specific shipments, specific market conditions, and specific family and business news across considerable distances, providing modern historians with an unusually direct and unusually personal window into the actual, lived commercial and family concerns of individual Silk Road merchants working many centuries ago, considerably more intimate and considerably more specific than the broader structural and economic patterns that this chapter's other sections have primarily examined. Local rulers and local city administrations across virtually every political jurisdiction the Silk Road's various route segments passed through derived considerable and genuinely essential fiscal revenue from tolls, taxes and customs duties levied on passing merchant caravans, a revenue stream substantial enough that maintaining secure, well-policed and well-maintained trade routes represented a genuine and consistent economic priority for rulers across the whole length of the network, since a reputation for excessive taxation, unreliable security, or poor road maintenance could genuinely and measurably redirect valuable trade traffic toward alternative competing route segments controlled by more accommodating neighboring rulers. A genuine competitive dynamic among the various political authorities along the route that provided an ongoing, practical incentive for reasonably merchant-friendly governance even among rulers who might otherwise have had little particular sympathy for foreign traders passing through their territory. Caravanserai, purpose-built roadside inns providing merchants, their pack animals and their goods with secure overnight lodging at regular intervals along the major trade routes, represented an essential piece of infrastructure without which sustained long-distance overland trade across the Silk Road's more remote and more dangerous stretches would have been considerably more difficult and considerably more dangerous to conduct, typically constructed around a large central courtyard capable of accommodating loaded pack animals, with surrounding rooms providing lodging for the merchants themselves, and often including stored provisions, water access, and in many cases, small attached mosques or other religious facilities, a network of way stations that various regional rulers and wealthy patrons across the Silk Road's long history took considerable pride and considerable practical political interest in funding and maintaining, since a well-maintained network of caravanserai directly supported the trade traffic and the associated tax revenue that made a given ruler's own territory an attractive and well-travelled section of the wider route. The practical business of long-distance Silk Road trade rarely involved any single merchant travelling the entire length of the route from China to the Mediterranean world in one continuous journey, and instead typically operated through a genuinely elaborate relay system in which goods changed hands multiple times across their long journey, with merchants specializing in particular regional segments of the route, buying goods from merchants arriving from the east, adding their own markup and selling onward to merchants continuing the goods journey further west. A genuinely sensible practical adaptation to the sheer physical difficulty, expense and danger of any single continuous end-to-end journey, though it also meant that the specific cultural and geographic origin of many traded goods became considerably obscured by the time they reached their final distant markets, with many Roman consumers of Chinese silk, for instance, possessing only the vaguest and often considerably inaccurate understanding of the actual distant land and actual distant people who had originally produced the luxurious fabric they wore. The genuine linguistic diversity that any single Silk Road journey typically traversed, potentially requiring communication across Chinese, various Central Asian, Turkic and Iranian languages, Persian, Arabic, and eventually Latin or Greek, depending on a given caravan's ultimate destination, made skilled interpreters and genuinely multilingual merchants, of exactly the kind the Sogdians already discussed in this chapter were particularly renowned for producing, an essential and genuinely valuable practical resource, and the considerable body of surviving multilingual documents recovered from Silk Road archaeological sites, including documents written in parallel across 2 or more different languages, provides modern historians with valuable direct evidence of exactly how practical cross-linguistic commercial communication was actually conducted along the route on a genuinely everyday practical basis. Beyond the merchants and caravan leaders already discussed throughout this chapter, A successful major caravan expedition required the coordinated labor of numerous additional specialized roles, including experienced animal handlers with genuine practical veterinary knowledge of camel health and camel care, since a sick or injured camel losing its ability to continue the journey could genuinely endanger the entire expedition's cargo and, in the most severe circumstances, its members' own survival. And specialized local guides, frequently recruited from communities with generations of accumulated practical knowledge of a particular difficult stretch of terrain, whose specific knowledge of reliable water sources, safe mountain passes, and areas of particular banditry risk represented a genuinely essential and genuinely well-compensated form of practical expertise that outside merchants, however experienced in the wider business of long-distance trade, typically could not safely replicate on their own without this kind of specific, hard-won local knowledge. Women's participation in Silk Road commercial life, while considerably less visible in the surviving documentary record than the activities of male merchants already discussed throughout this chapter, nonetheless extended well beyond the purely domestic sphere in numerous documented instances, with surviving Sogdian and Chinese commercial and legal documents recording women engaged in independent trading activity, property ownership, and formal commercial contracts, particularly within prosperous merchant families where a wife or widow might take on direct management responsibility for family trading interests during a husband's own extended absence on a lengthy caravan journey, or following his death, a pattern of practical female commercial agency that several modern historians studying the considerable body of surviving Silk Road legal and commercial documentation have identified as considerably more extensive than earlier, more male-centered historical accounts of the trade network had generally acknowledged. The considerable financial risk inherent in any long-distance Silk Road trading venture, given the genuine possibility of banditry, difficult weather, political instability, or simple accident along the route, drove the development of increasingly sophisticated commercial financial instruments and commercial partnership arrangements across the trade network's long history, including various forms of risk-sharing investment partnerships in which multiple investors would collectively fund a single caravan expedition in exchange for a proportional share of its eventual profits, a genuinely early and genuinely practical form of commercial risk diversification that parallels in certain interesting respects similarly motivated risk-sharing commercial arrangements that developed independently in other major pre-modern trading civilizations, including the Mediterranean maritime trading world. The Silk Road's own commercial fortunes across its long history were genuinely and directly shaped by the shifting political circumstances of the numerous empires and kingdoms whose territories the various route segments passed through, since sustained, profitable long-distance trade required a reasonable degree of political stability and reasonable protection from banditry across the entire length of any given trade journey, meaning that periods of strong, stable imperial control across large stretches of the route, including the Han dynasty in China already introduced in this episode's first chapter, the Parthian and later Sasanian Persian empires, controlling much of the route's Iranian midsection, and the Roman and later Byzantine Empire anchoring its western Mediterranean terminus, generally corresponded to periods of increased trade volume and increased Silk Road prosperity, while periods of political fragmentation or conflict along any given stretch of the route tended to correspondingly suppress or redirect trade activity. The Kushan Empire, controlling a genuinely significant stretch of territory spanning parts of modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India during the first several centuries of the Common Era, occupied a crucial intermediary geographic position connecting the Silk Road's Central Asian routes to the considerable maritime and overland trade networks of the Indian subcontinent, and Kushan rulers, most notably the Emperor Kanishka, actively patronized Buddhism and actively supported the wider cultural and commercial exchange this episode's second chapter has already examined, making the Kushan realm one of the single most historically significant, if today comparatively less well remembered, political powers shaping the Silk Road's early centuries of development, a genuine crossroads empire whose own considerable prosperity depended almost entirely on successfully managing and taxing the very transcontinental trade flows this whole episode examines. The Kushan Empire, controlling a genuinely significant stretch of territory spanning parts of modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India during the first several centuries of the Common Era, occupied a crucial intermediary geographic position connecting the Silk Road's Central Asian routes to the considerable maritime and overland trade networks of the Indian subcontinent, and Kushan rulers, most notably the Emperor Kanishka, actively patronized Buddhism and actively supported the wider cultural and commercial exchange this episode's second chapter has already examined, making the Kushan realm one of the single most historically significant, if today comparatively less well remembered, political powers shaping the Silk Road's early centuries of development. A genuine crossroads empire whose own considerable prosperity depended almost entirely on successfully managing and taxing the very transcontinental trade flows this whole episode examines. The later Gupta Empire, ruling much of northern India during the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, presided over a genuine golden age of Indian mathematical, scientific and artistic achievement that connected through both overland Silk Road routes already examined throughout this episode and separate but related maritime Indian Ocean trading networks to the wider Eurasian exchange of goods and ideas this whole episode has traced, with Gupta-era Indian mathematical innovations, including the decimal place value numeral system that would eventually transmit westward through the Islamic world and reach medieval Europe as the so-called Arabic numerals still used almost universally today, representing a further genuinely significant example of exactly the kind of transcontinental intellectual transmission this episode's broader examination of Silk Road cultural exchange has repeatedly emphasized, even when, as in this particular case, the specific transmission pathway ran at least partly through maritime and southern overland connections, operating somewhat apart from the more northerly Central Asian routes this episode has primarily focused upon. The Parthian Empire, controlling much of ancient Persia and Mesopotamia during the same general period that the Roman Republic and later Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean world, occupied a genuinely crucial intermediary position within the wider Silk Road network, since Parthian merchants and Parthian territory controlled the essential middle segment of the route connecting Chinese and Central Asian trade goods to Roman Mediterranean markets, a position of considerable commercial advantage that Parthian authorities apparently worked to actively maintain, including, according to some ancient sources, a degree of deliberate commercial gatekeeping intended to prevent direct Roman and Chinese merchant contact that might have allowed either side to bypass Parthian middleman profits entirely. The later Sasanian Persian Empire, succeeding the Parthians as the dominant political power across much of Persia and Mesopotamia from the 3rd century of the Common Era onward, developed its own considerable domestic silk weaving industry, using imported raw Chinese silk thread, producing distinctively Persian patterned silk textiles that themselves became genuinely significant luxury trade goods carried onward toward Byzantine and eventually wider European markets, meaning that by the later centuries of the Sasanian period, silk moving westward along the trade route had frequently already been transformed through skilled Persian craftsmanship from a purely Chinese raw material into a genuinely hybrid Perso-Chinese luxury good before it ever reached its final Mediterranean destination. The later Sasanian Persian Empire, succeeding the Parthians as the dominant political power across much of Persia and Mesopotamia from the 3rd century of the Common Era onward, developed its own considerable domestic silk weaving industry using imported raw Chinese silk thread, producing distinctively Persian patterned silk textiles that themselves became genuinely significant luxury trade goods carried onward toward Byzantine and eventually wider European markets, meaning that by the later centuries of the Sasanian period, silk moving westward along the trade route had frequently already been transformed, through skilled Persian craftsmanship, from a purely Chinese raw material into a genuinely hybrid Perso-Chinese luxury good, before it ever reached its final Mediterranean destination. The Han dynasty's own relationship with the Zhongnug Confederation, already discussed extensively throughout this episode, extended, at various points across its long history, well beyond simple military conflict, encompassing a genuinely significant diplomatic institution modern historians call Hekin, marriage alliance, in which Han imperial princesses, or in several documented cases women of high status specifically selected to be presented as princesses for diplomatic purposes, were sent to marry Zhongnug rulers as part of formal peace agreements, accompanied by substantial gifts of silk, grain, and other valuable goods, a genuinely pragmatic diplomatic strategy that, whatever its own considerable human cost for the specific women involved, who typically never returned to their own Chinese homeland, helped maintain periods of relative peace and relatively secure trade conditions along the crucial eastern stretches of the route during the intervals when this particular diplomatic strategy remained politically viable for both sides. The Tang dynasty's own considerable military and diplomatic expansion into Central Asia during the 7th century, particularly under the Emperor Taizong, extended direct or indirect Chinese political influence considerably further west than the earlier Han dynasty had generally managed to sustain, briefly bringing a substantial portion of the Silk Road's eastern and central stretches under a degree of unified Chinese oversight that facilitated exactly the kind of increased trade volume and increased cultural exchange this episode's 2nd and 3rd chapters have already examined in connection with Tang-era Chang'an's own remarkable cosmopolitan flourishing, before this same Tang expansion was eventually checked by the rising power of the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate at the significant Battle of Talas in 751, an engagement whose outcome helped determine that Central Asia's own longer-term religious and cultural development would trend toward the Islamic rather than the Chinese Confucian cultural sphere, a genuinely consequential single battle whose long-term civilizational consequences considerably outlasted its own comparatively modest immediate military significance. Direct diplomatic contact between Rome and China itself remained, throughout the whole of ancient history, genuinely rare and genuinely limited, with Chinese historical records describing what appears to have been a Roman diplomatic or merchant mission reaching the Han court in the year 166 of the Common Era, claiming to represent the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, though modern historians remain uncertain whether this mission represented genuine official Roman diplomacy or, perhaps more plausibly, an enterprising merchant group claiming grander official status than they actually possessed in order to secure a more favorable reception at the Chinese imperial court, a genuinely characteristic piece of uncertainty surrounding the two empires' rare and heavily intermediary-filtered direct contact that this episode's own earlier discussion of Parthian commercial gatekeeping helps explain. The most historically consequential single political transformation affecting the wider Silk Road trade network came with the 13th century Mongol conquests, which, despite inflicting genuinely catastrophic destruction on numerous individual cities including Merv, already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter, ultimately produced, once the initial period of conquest and consolidation had passed, an unprecedented and genuinely remarkable era of transcontinental political unification and transcontinental trade security that modern historians have come to call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, during which a single traveller, protected by Mongol imperial authority and Mongol-issued travel documents called Paisa, could journey in relative safety across a genuinely enormous stretch of Eurasian territory that had in earlier centuries been divided among numerous separate and often mutually hostile political authorities, a period of unified political control that this same episode's later chapters will examine as directly enabling both the celebrated travels of the Venetian merchant Marco Polo and the considerably less celebrated but historically more consequential westward transmission of bubonic plague that this episode's 7th chapter will examine in fuller detail. The Mongol Empire's own considerable administrative innovations supporting this transcontinental trade security included a genuinely sophisticated relay postal and communication system called the Yam, consisting of regularly spaced stations providing fresh horses, food, and lodging for official messengers and, by extension, for merchants and travelers carrying the appropriate Paisa travel authorization already mentioned, a system of infrastructure investment and administrative coordination across an empire spanning from Korea to Eastern Europe that considerably impressed contemporary travelers, including Marco Polo himself, who described the Mongol postal relay system in his own later travel account with evident and genuine admiration for its speed and its reliability. The Tang dynasty's own considerable military and diplomatic expansion into Central Asia during the 7th century, particularly under the Emperor Taizong, extended direct or indirect Chinese political influence considerably further west than the earlier Han dynasty had generally managed to sustain, briefly bringing a substantial portion of the Silk Road's eastern and central stretches under a degree of unified Chinese oversight that facilitated exactly the kind of increased trade volume and increased cultural exchange this episode's 2nd and 3rd chapters have already examined in connection with Tang-era Chang'an's own remarkable cosmopolitan flourishing, before this same Tang expansion was eventually checked by the rising power of the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate at the significant Battle of Talas in 751, an engagement whose outcome helped determine that Central Asia's own longer-term religious and cultural development would trend toward the Islamic rather than the Chinese Confucian cultural sphere, a genuinely consequential single battle whose long-term civilizational consequences considerably outlasted its own comparatively modest immediate military significance. The Battle of Talas carries a further genuinely significant historical footnote directly relevant to this episode's own earlier discussion of paper's westward transmission, since Chinese prisoners captured following the Abbasid victory reportedly included skilled papermakers whose own subsequently transmitted practical knowledge of Chinese papermaking technique is credited by several ancient and modern historians alike with directly introducing paper production to the Islamic world at Samarkand within just a few years of the battle itself, a genuinely striking example of exactly how directly military conflict, quite apart from the ordinary peaceful merchant trade this whole episode has primarily examined, could also serve as a channel for genuinely significant technological transmission along the Silk Road's own tangled and often quite violent history. Byzantine-Sasanian relations across the 6th and early 7th centuries were repeatedly strained by ongoing competition over control of the lucrative silk trade already discussed extensively throughout this episode, with the Byzantine Emperor Justinian's own sponsorship of the silkworm smuggling mission already discussed in this episode's 4th chapter, representing in part a genuinely deliberate strategic response to Sasanian Persian efforts to maintain their own profitable middleman position, controlling the overland silk trade route between China and the Byzantine Mediterranean world, a genuinely direct connection between this episode's earlier discussion of silk's specific commercial history and this chapter's own wider examination of how control over Silk Road trade routes repeatedly shaped the strategic calculations and occasionally the outright military conflicts of the major political powers positioned along its length. The most historically consequential single political transformation affecting the wider Silk Road trade network came with the 13th century Mongol conquests, which, despite inflicting genuinely catastrophic destruction on numerous individual cities including Merv, already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter, ultimately produced, once the initial period of conquest and consolidation had passed, an unprecedented and genuinely remarkable era of transcontinental political unification and transcontinental trade security that modern historians have come to call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, during which a single traveller protected by Mongol imperial authority and Mongol-issued travel documents called paisa, could journey in relative safety across a genuinely enormous stretch of Eurasian territory that had, in earlier centuries, been divided among numerous separate and often mutually hostile political authorities, a period of unified political control that this same episode's later chapters will examine as directly enabling both the celebrated travels of the Mysian merchant Marco Polo and the considerably less celebrated but historically more consequential westward transmission of bubonic plague that this episode's 7th chapter will examine in fuller detail. The Mongol Empire's own considerable and, by the standards of many contemporary political authorities elsewhere in the medieval world, genuinely remarkable policy of religious tolerance across its enormous and religiously diverse conquered territories represented a further significant factor supporting the wider trade and cultural exchange this whole episode examines, since Mongol rulers, whose own original steppe religious tradition centered on shamanistic practice, generally declined to impose any single official state religion upon their conquered subjects, instead permitting Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, and other religious communities to continue practicing largely undisturbed, provided they accepted Mongol political authority, a genuinely pragmatic policy that considerably facilitated the continued movement of merchants, missionaries, and pilgrims of every religious background this episode's 2nd chapter has already examined across the newly unified Mongol territorial expanse, since none of these travelers needed to fear systematic religious persecution specifically on account of their own particular faith while passing through Mongol-controlled lands, a genuinely significant practical advantage for sustained cross-cultural trade and cross-cultural exchange that several less religiously tolerant political regimes elsewhere in the medieval world simply could not offer their own traveling merchants and travelers. Kublai Khan's own court at the new Mongol capital of Khan Balik, on the site of modern Beijing, developed into a genuinely remarkable cosmopolitan center in its own right during the later 13th century, attracting not only the merchants and travelers already discussed throughout this episode, but also skilled administrators, engineers, and scholars drawn from across the whole breadth of the Mongol Empire's conquered territories, including, according to Marco Polo's own account already discussed in this chapter, Polo's own personal employment within the Mongol imperial administration for a period of several years, a genuinely cosmopolitan administrative culture that reflected the same wider pattern of religious and cultural tolerance already discussed in this same paragraph's preceding material, since Kublai Khan and his Mongol successors generally proved willing to employ talented administrators regardless of their own specific ethnic or religious background, provided they demonstrated genuine loyalty and genuine administrative competence in Mongol imperial service. Marco Polo's own celebrated late 13th century journey along the Silk Road to the court of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, and his subsequent lengthy period of travel and, according to his own account, imperial service within Kublai Khan's own administration before his eventual return to Venice, produced, through the travel account he later dictated while imprisoned following his capture during a Venetian military conflict, one of the single most historically influential pieces of medieval European travel literature. A work that, whatever specific questions modern historians continue to raise regarding the precise accuracy and even the full authenticity of certain specific details within Polo's own account, considerably shaped subsequent medieval and early modern European understanding of and fascination with the distant lands that the Silk Road connected, and that would, considerably later, directly influence the geographic thinking of explorers including Christopher Columbus, who owned and extensively annotated his own personal copy of Polo's account. Diplomatic exchange along the Silk Road extended well beyond the purely commercial relationships already discussed throughout this chapter, with various Chinese dynasties, Persian empires, and eventually Mongol Khanates maintaining active diplomatic correspondence and periodic embassy exchanges with distant courts, including, in several well-documented instances, direct diplomatic contact between Mongol Khans and medieval European Christian rulers and the papacy itself, driven substantially by shared, though ultimately unrealized, hopes of establishing a military alliance against the common threat that the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria posed to both Mongol territorial ambitions in the Middle East and European Christian crusading interests in the same region. A genuinely fascinating episode of medieval transcontinental diplomacy that illustrates just how far the Silk Road's own political and commercial connections extended into complex, genuinely consequential geopolitical strategy, well beyond simple trade in silk and spices. The same Pax Mongolica trade security and increased transcontinental mobility already discussed in this episode's 6th chapter, as a genuine boon to Silk Road commerce, also produced, tragically, one of the single most consequential examples of unintended pathogen transmission in the whole of recorded human history, since the bubonic plague bacterium, believed by most modern historians and epidemiologists to have originated in rodent populations somewhere in Central Asia, appears to have spread westward along these same well-traveled and now considerably more secure trade routes during the early and middle decades of the 14th century, eventually reaching the Crimean Black Sea coast, from where Genoese merchant ships carried the infection into the Mediterranean world, triggering the catastrophic pandemic known as the Black Death, that this channel's own coverage of medieval Europe has already examined in fuller detail, a genuinely sobering illustration of how the very same infrastructure of connection and exchange that made the Silk Road such a historically significant channel for goods, religion, and ideas could, under the wrong circumstances, prove equally efficient at spreading catastrophic disease across the very same enormous geographic distance. Modern genetic and historical research into the specific origins and specific transmission pathway of the 14th century plague pandemic has increasingly focused on a Central Asian source region, with archaeological evidence from cemetery sites near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan showing a significant spike in burials during the mid-1340s, several years before the plague's documented arrival in the Crimea and the wider Mediterranean world, evidence that several research teams have connected to genetic analysis of the plague bacterium's own evolutionary history, together suggesting a specific Central Asian origin point from which the disease then spread outward along exactly the same well-traveled and, thanks to the Pax Mongolica already discussed in this episode's 6th chapter, unusually secure and unusually well-connected trade routes that had made the whole preceding century's trade boom possible in the first place. The specific documented episode connecting Central Asian plague to its eventual arrival in the Mediterranean world centers on the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa in the Crimea, besieged in 1346 by Mongol forces themselves already afflicted by the disease, with a later, admittedly somewhat sensationalized medieval account describing the besieging Mongol army catapulting plague-infected corpses over the city walls in an early and genuinely horrifying form of biological warfare, before eventually abandoning the siege, after which fleeing Genoese merchant ships, whether carrying the disease through this specific catapult transmission, or, as modern epidemiologists consider more likely, through infected rats and fleas travelling more conventionally aboard the same departing vessels, carried the plague onward to Mediterranean ports including Constantinople and Sicily, from where it spread with catastrophic speed across the whole of the following years into virtually every corner of Europe. The gradual political fragmentation of the unified Mongol Khanates across the 14th century, breaking apart into increasingly independent and increasingly mutually hostile successor states, considerably undermined the transcontinental political stability that had made the Pax Mongolica trading boom possible, restoring, across large stretches of the Central Asian midsection of the route, a kind of political fragmentation and reduced trade security that had characterized earlier historical periods before the Mongol unification. A genuine political fragmentation that, combined with the demographic and economic disruption the Black Death itself inflicted across both Asia and Europe, contributed to a genuine and sustained decline in overland Silk Road trade volume across the following century. Timur, already introduced in this episode's third chapter in connection with his considerable architectural patronage of Samarkand, attempted, across the final decades of the 14th century, the genuinely ambitious personal project of reunifying much of the former Mongol trading sphere under his own direct military and political control, a project that achieved considerable, if ultimately temporary, success in restoring trade security across large stretches of the Central Asian route network during his own lifetime. But that, following Timur's own death in 1405, while preparing a planned invasion of China, gradually gave way once again to the same pattern of regional political fragmentation that had characterized the decades immediately following the original Mongol Khanate's own earlier breakup, illustrating just how genuinely dependent the overland route's sustained commercial prosperity remain across its entire history on the specific presence or absence of exactly this kind of unified, trade-friendly political authority spanning its full geographic length. Timur, already introduced in this episode's third chapter in connection with his considerable architectural patronage of Samarkand, attempted, across the final decades of the 14th century, the genuinely ambitious personal project of reunifying much of the former Mongol trading sphere under his own direct military and political control, a project that achieved considerable, if ultimately temporary, success in restoring trade security across large stretches of the Central Asian route network during his own lifetime, but that, following Timur's own death in 1405, while preparing a planned invasion of China, gradually gave way once again to the same pattern of regional political fragmentation that had characterized the decades immediately following the original Mongol Khanate's own earlier breakup, illustrating just how genuinely dependent the overland route's sustained commercial prosperity remain across its entire history on the specific presence or absence of exactly this kind of unified, trade-friendly political authority spanning its full geographic length. The considerable demographic catastrophe that the Black Death inflicted across both Asia and Europe during the middle decades of the 14th century, with modern historical demographic estimates suggesting a mortality rate reaching as high as a third or more of the total affected population across many regions, produced genuinely severe and genuinely lasting economic disruption, extending well beyond the immediate human tragedy already discussed in this episode's own coverage of the pandemic's origins, since the sudden, catastrophic loss of such a substantial proportion of the working population across so many trading cities and agricultural regions alike severely disrupted the specialized craft production, agricultural surplus, and skilled merchant expertise that sustained trade required, with numerous Silk Road oasis cities and trading centers experiencing population declines from which some never fully recovered even after the immediate pandemic itself had passed, a genuine and lasting economic scar that compounded the wider political fragmentation already discussed in this chapter to produce the considerable and sustained overland trade decline this whole chapter is examined. The rise of the Ottoman Empire across the 14th and 15th centuries, culminating in the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, already discussed in this channel's own earlier coverage of Byzantium's own final fall, placed an increasingly powerful and increasingly commercially assertive political authority directly across the western terminus of the overland Silk Road routes connecting Asia to the Mediterranean world, and Ottoman control over this crucial commercial choke point, combined with the Ottoman Empire's own considerable taxation of the trade passing through its territory, provided a genuinely significant additional economic incentive for European merchants and European monarchs to actively seek alternative maritime trade routes to Asia that could bypass Ottoman territory and consequently Ottoman taxation entirely. This search for alternative maritime routes to the wealth of Asia directly motivated the celebrated European age of exploration voyages of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, including Vasco da Gama's eventual successful sea route around the southern tip of Africa to India in 1498, a genuinely grueling voyage that took the Portuguese navigator's small fleet nearly a full year to complete, and that, upon his eventual safe return to Portugal, with a cargo of Indian spices sold at an enormously profitable markup, definitively demonstrated that a viable, entirely maritime trade connection to Asia, bypassing the overland Silk Road and its associated Ottoman and other intermediary tolls entirely, was now genuinely achievable, and, in a considerably more indirect but historically even more consequential fashion, Christopher Columbus's own westward Atlantic voyage in 1492, undertaken in the explicit hope of reaching Asia by sailing west rather than east, a hope directly informed, as this episode's 6th chapter has already noted, by Columbus's own careful study of Marco Polo's earlier Silk Road travel account, meaning that the overland Silk Road's own gradual commercial decline directly and quite dramatically helped motivate the maritime voyages that would eventually establish entirely new, considerably more efficient sea-based trade connections between Europe and Asia, connections that would, over the following centuries, gradually and permanently displace the overland Silk Road from its earlier position as the primary channel of Eurasian long-distance trade. The overland Silk Road did not, however, disappear entirely, even as its relative commercial significance declined across the following centuries, with certain regional trade connections and certain specific commodity trades continuing to operate across various stretches of the historical route network well into the early modern and even modern periods, even as the route's earlier role as the single primary channel connecting the economies of China, Central Asia, the Middle East and Europe had, by the 16th and 17th centuries, been substantially and permanently superseded by the considerably faster, considerably higher volume maritime trade routes that European sailing ships had, by this point, thoroughly established across the world's major oceans. The modern historical and popular understanding of the Silk Road as a single, coherent, named trade network, already noted in this episode's first chapter as a considerably later historical construction rather than an ancient self-description, owes its origin to the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen, who coined the German term Seidenstrasse, literally Silk Road, in his multi-volume 1877 work on China, a piece of 19th century European scholarly naming that proved genuinely and lastingly influential, rapidly entering both scholarly and popular usage across the following decades, and eventually stabilizing into the now universal English term Silk Road that this entire episode has used throughout, even though, as this episode's 4th chapter has already discussed at length, silk itself represented only one among many genuinely significant categories of goods that the network's merchants actually carried across its long active history. Beyond Orelstein, already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter, numerous other significant explorer archaeologists conducted major expeditions across the Silk Road region during this same general late 19th and early 20th century period, including the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, whose own considerable mapping and archaeological work across the Taklamakan Desert region produced genuinely significant new geographic and historical knowledge, even as his own expeditions, like Stein's, participated in the same broader pattern of removing significant archaeological material to European institutions, and various Japanese, Russian, French and German expeditions conducted across these same decades, together constituting what modern historians of archaeology sometimes call the Great Game of Silk Road archaeological exploration, a period of intense competitive international scholarly and, in several cases, genuinely acquisitive interest in the region's rich but at the time still largely undocumented archaeological heritage. Beyond Orelstein, already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter, numerous other significant explorer archaeologists conducted major expeditions across the Silk Road region during this same general late 19th and early 20th century period, including the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, whose own considerable mapping and archaeological work across the Taklamakan Desert region produced genuinely significant new geographic and historical knowledge, even as his own expeditions, like Stein's, participated in the same broader pattern of removing significant archaeological material to European institutions, and various Japanese, Russian, French and German expeditions conducted across these same decades, together constituting what modern historians of archaeology sometimes call the Great Game of Silk Road archaeological exploration, a period of intense competitive international scholarly and, in several cases, genuinely acquisitive interest in the region's rich but at the time still largely undocumented archaeological heritage. Modern genetic and archaeogenetic research into the human populations that lived and travelled along the historical Silk Road has, in recent years, produced genuinely significant new scientific insight into the actual physical extent of the population mixing and population movement that the trade network's many centuries of sustained cross-continental contact produced, with genetic analysis of human remains recovered from Silk Road burial sites across Central Asia, revealing genuinely complex patterns of ancestry, drawing on East Asian, Central Asian, South Asian, and even, in some documented cases, European genetic contributions, providing modern scientists with genuinely direct biological confirmation of the same pattern of sustained, multi-directional human contact and human mixing that the considerably more indirect archaeological and documentary evidence this whole episode has primarily relied upon has long suggested a genuinely valuable scientific complement to the wider historical picture this episode has worked to construct. Modern tourism along the historical Silk Road route has developed into a genuinely significant contemporary industry in its own right, with dedicated multi-week overland tour itineraries now available, connecting many of the same major cities this episode has examined throughout its preceding chapters, from Xi'an, the modern successor to ancient Chang'an, through Dunhuang and its remarkable Mogao caves across the Central Asian republics to Samarkand and Bukhara, allowing modern travelers with sufficient time and sufficient interest to retrace in a journey considerably more comfortable and considerably less physically dangerous than anything the historical merchants this episode has followed ever experienced. At least the general outline of the same extraordinary transcontinental route, a modern form of engaged historical tourism that reflects the same enduring popular fascination with the Silk Road's own romantic and adventurous historical reputation that this whole episode has, in its own more careful and more historically grounded way, tried to honestly examine rather than simply repeat uncritically. The considerable body of surviving Silk Road manuscripts, artifacts and archaeological sites that this entire episode has drawn upon throughout its preceding chapters continues, even now, to yield genuinely new historical discoveries as ongoing archaeological survey and ongoing manuscript study proceeds across the whole geographic breadth of the historical route, a genuinely active and genuinely still developing field of international historical scholarship that reminds us, much as this channel's own coverage of numerous other historical topics has repeatedly emphasized, that even a trade network as extensively studied and as thoroughly documented as the Silk Road still holds considerable additional historical understanding, still waiting to be carefully, patiently uncovered by the next generation of archaeologists, historians and manuscript scholars willing to do the same kind of painstaking, unhurried work that this whole episode has celebrated throughout its examination of the merchants, monks, and scholars who actually built and maintained this remarkable transcontinental network across so many patient centuries. The modern China-Kazakhstan railway connection, along with several comparable modern rail infrastructure projects connecting China to Central Asian and eventually European markets developed substantially under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, already discussed earlier in this chapter, follows in broad general outline, if certainly not in every specific technical detail, remarkably similar geographic routing to significant stretches of the historical overland Silk Road, a genuinely striking modern echo of the ancient trade geography this whole episode has examined, since the same fundamental physical geography, the same mountain passes, the same viable desert crossing points that shaped merchant caravan routes some 2,000 years ago continues, even in an age of high-speed rail and container shipping, to shape the most practical and most economically efficient paths for moving goods across this same enormous stretch of Eurasian continental terrain. The considerable archaeological rediscovery and archaeological documentation of the Silk Road's physical remains, including the sealed manuscript library at Dunhuang, already discussed in this episode's third chapter, proceeded substantially through a series of major European, Japanese, Russian, and eventually Chinese archaeological expeditions across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, expeditions whose own considerable scholarly achievements in documenting and preserving Silk Road archaeological and manuscript material were, in several well-documented and still genuinely controversial cases, accompanied by the removal of significant quantities of manuscripts and artifacts from their original sites to museums and research institutions in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere, a pattern of archaeological practice that modern scholars and, increasingly, the modern Chinese government have continued to debate and, in various specific cases, to formally contest, raising genuine and still unresolved questions regarding the proper ownership, proper location, and proper stewardship of this considerable body of significant historical material. The specific UNESCO-recognized route network, formerly titled the Silk Roads, the routes network of Chang'an-Tianshan Corridor, encompasses some 33 individual archaeological and historical sites spread across the 3 participating nations, ranging from ancient city ruins and Buddhist cave temple complexes to sections of surviving caravanserai and fortification infrastructure, a carefully selected representative sample of the network's own genuinely enormous total physical extent and the designation's own explicit framing as a shared, multinational cultural heritage rather than the exclusive historical property of any single modern nation, reflects a genuinely deliberate and genuinely significant piece of modern international heritage diplomacy, itself a considered response to the same underlying historical reality this whole episode has repeatedly emphasized, that the Silk Road's genuine historical significance lay precisely in its function as a shared, multinational and multicultural achievement, rather than the accomplishment of any single civilization operating alone. UNESCO formally recognized substantial portions of the historical Silk Road route network as a World Heritage Site in 2014, a coordinated multinational designation covering a network of specific significant sites across China, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, reflecting a genuinely significant modern international recognition of the route's shared, transnational historical and cultural significance, a designation that required years of careful diplomatic coordination among the several modern nations whose territory the historical route network passed through, itself a genuinely fitting modern echo of the considerable diplomatic and political coordination that sustained functioning of the historical Silk Road trade network had always, across its many centuries of active operation, actually required. The modern Chinese government's own considerable contemporary infrastructure and economic development initiative, known as the Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013 and encompassing an enormous program of infrastructure investment, including railways, ports and pipelines across dozens of countries throughout Asia, Africa and Europe, has been explicitly and repeatedly framed by Chinese officials as a deliberate modern revival of the historical Silk Road's own spirit of transcontinental connection and transcontinental trade, a genuinely significant piece of modern political and economic rhetoric that, whatever the specific merits or specific controversies surrounding the initiative's actual practical implementation, which this episode notes without offering any particular assessment, given the genuinely contested and still rapidly evolving nature of the ongoing contemporary policy debate surrounding it, speaks to just how powerfully and just how persistently the historical memory of the ancient and medieval Silk Road continues to shape contemporary political and economic imagination across the entire Eurasian landmass that its own historical roots once connected. The specific linguistic legacy of Silk Road trade contact remains genuinely visible today in numerous everyday words across widely separated modern languages, with the English word orange, for instance, tracing an etymological path back through Old French and Arabic to an original Sanskrit and Dravidian source, reflecting the fruit's own South Asian origin and its own gradual westward trade transmission, and comparable etymological trails connecting numerous other everyday commodity names, including sugar, silk itself, and musk, back through multiple intermediary languages to their own original points of Asian production, a body of quiet linguistic evidence embedded in words most modern speakers use every single day, without any particular awareness of their own considerable Silk Road history, that provides a genuinely tangible everyday reminder of just how thoroughly this ancient trade network shaped the modern world in ways that extend well beyond the more obviously dramatic political and religious legacies this episode's other chapters have already examined. The Silk Road's own enduring cultural legacy extends across an extraordinary wide range of subsequent artistic, culinary, linguistic, and technological domains, well beyond the specific political and economic legacies already discussed in this chapter, since the genuinely enormous scope and genuinely enormous duration of cross-cultural contact that the trade network sustained across well over 1,000 years left permanent traces in everything from the specific vocabulary of numerous Eurasian languages to the ingredients and techniques of numerous regional culinary traditions, to the fundamental technologies including paper, gunpowder, and the compass, whose own gradual east-to-west transmission along these same trade routes helped directly enable the subsequent European Renaissance and the wider early modern transformation of European society, a genuinely vast and genuinely still unfolding historical legacy that this single episode has only been able to begin to trace across its own necessarily limited 8 chapters. And so we leave the Silk Road resting in the quiet dark of a desert night. Camels settled, fires burning low, the whole enormous network of routes and cities and caravans stretching out, unseen but still somehow present, across the many thousands of miles between China and the Mediterranean world. We considered, across this whole long journey together, just how much of the modern world we now take for granted: paper, gunpowder, the compass, the very numerals used to write down these dates, first travelled this same patient, dusty road long before it ever reached the hands that would eventually put it to such transformative use. We stood at Chang'an's own bustling foreign markets, and we sat in the candlelit cave temples of Dunhuang, and we walked the tiled blue courtyards of Samarkand, cities that had, in most cases, never once been visited by rulers from the opposite end of the very trade network that made them so prosperous, and yet whose own daily life had been shaped, in ways large and small, by goods and ideas and people arriving from thousands of miles away. We rode with the Sogdian merchants who spoke half a dozen languages fluently enough to broker a fair deal in any of them, and we sheltered for the night inside caravanserai walls built by rulers who never personally travelled the roads their own careful infrastructure investment made so much safer for everyone else. We stood beside a Buddhist monk copying scripture in a candlelit cave at Dunhuang, and beside a Nestorian priest raising a stone monument in a Chinese capital thousands of miles from anywhere his own faith had first been preached, and beside a Sufi poet composing verses in a language he had only learned after his own family fled westward ahead of an advancing army. We felt the strange, terrible double legacy of the Mongol peace. The same secure roads carrying both eager merchants and, eventually, an entirely unintended and entirely catastrophic disease, and we watched at the very end European sailors set out across open oceans specifically because a Genoese sultanate's tax collectors had made the old overland road too expensive to keep using. These are human stories. The merchants were human, and so were the monks and the diplomats and the camel drivers who actually made this whole impossibly long chain of connection work, one exhausting, carefully planned journey at a time, across mountains and deserts that had no interest at all in making any of it easy for them. Generation after generation of ordinary people simply trying to get a valuable, fragile cargo safely from one distant market to the next, carrying with them, whether they ever fully realized it or not, entire religions and entire ways of thinking about the world, along with their more ordinary bundles of silk and spice and stone, each single small journey adding one more quiet thread to a tapestry none of them could ever have seen whole. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small quiet comment below, letting me know, if you'd like, where in the world tonight's story happens to have found you. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight, carrying just a little of that same old patient, well-travelled quiet along with them into their own rest. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue, and let the old world keep talking in its old slow voice, one distant caravan and one quiet oasis city after another, for as long as you care to keep listening tonight. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The caravan has stopped for the night. The camels are settled, and the last fire has burned down to embers. The whole enormous, impossibly long road from China to the Mediterranean has finally gone quiet, at least for tonight, resting the same way it has rested at the end of countless other nights across more than 1,000 years. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop, slowly, the way they drop at the end of any long, well-earned day's travel. Let your hands open slowly, the way hands open when a long day's journey has finally at last come to its end. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like a camel train moving steadily across a moonlit desert, patient and old and entirely unhurried by how far it still has left to go, one more night's careful, steady distance closer to wherever it is finally headed. Sleep well, and good night, wherever in this quiet world tonight's old story finds you resting, however far that long, dusty desert road may be from wherever you happen to be resting tonight, and however many centuries now separate you from the very last caravan that ever crossed it.